Over the plains of northern Gaul, the evening sky burns a bruised red while ravens circle low, as if the earth already expects slaughter. Beyond the dark horizon rides Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, driving a vast coalition of horsemen and tribes toward a world with nowhere left to run. To stop him, Rome now stands shoulder to shoulder with its old executioners, the Visigoths, enemies bound together only by fear of the same approaching storm. Later, they will whisper that so many fell here that the dead rose into the clouds and kept fighting for days across the bleeding sky. He appears first as a presence more than a man, a hard, narrow face beneath a plain helmet, eyes that never seem surprised by ruin. Behind him, memory reels like a nightmare. Cities along the Danube burned black, walls that once held legions now sagging and charred, refugees stumbling along the roads while the smoke still rises. In imperial halls far away, Roman envoys with trembling hands count out heaps of gold, tribute paid just to keep the horsemen on the far bank one more year. In darkened churches, bishops whisper that this is no ordinary warlord at all, but the Scourge of God, unleashed to punish a world that has forgotten how to fear. Around him stretches a kingdom without marble or palaces, a roaming empire made of tents, horses, and plunder, spreading from the endless steppe to the cold rivers of the Rhine. The Huns leave no walls behind them, only ashes and stories, a storm that never settles, only moves on to the next horizon. Even among hardened Germanic warriors who fight at his side, his name is spoken with caution, as if it might summon him out of the dark. For Romans on the frontier, that name travels ahead of his banners like thunder before a coming storm, a warning that the ground itself is about to shake. Now the storm is rolling toward Gaul. This is not a quick raid to snatch Catalan captives, not a passing blaze that will burn out on its own. Attila is driving his coalition west like a hammer aimed at the heart of the dying empire, the first blow in a catastrophe that could finish what centuries of enemies began. In the west, the empire that once wrapped the Mediterranean in marble and law is rotting from the edges inward. The treasuries in Ravenna are thin, full of promissory notes and clipped coins instead of solid gold, while whole provinces slip away like stones crumbling from an old wall. Emperors sit on fragile thrones, puppets wrapped in purple, their real power measured not in legions, but in which general chooses to stand behind them that year. Rome still calls itself the master of the world, but its voice is a hoarse echo in empty halls. Into this hollowed shell steps Flavius Aetius, the man later called the last of the Romans, who spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and learned their language, their rhythms, their hungers. He knows that the empire cannot field the old iron legions anymore, so he stitches together a patchwork of foederati on the frontiers, Germanic warriors fighting under Roman eagles for promises of land instead of pay. Every alliance he makes is fragile, every oath double-edged, and he walks a narrow line between a weak emperor in Ravenna and ambitious barbarian kings who smell the corpse of an old order. Where others cling to illusions, Aetius deals in the hard currency of fear, respect, and necessity. He understands that against Attila, Rome will not win by pride or tradition, only by borrowing the strength of those who once sacked its cities. His thoughts turn toward Gaul, where the Hunnic storm is already gathering, and he begins to call in every favor, every treaty, every scrap of loyalty he has left. What he is planning is not a glorious Roman victory in the old style, but a desperate stand to keep the world from ending on someone else's terms. By the time his armies march, the Western Empire is already half dead, limping toward the battlefield on the will of one man who refuses to let it die quietly. In Aquitaine, the night air inside the war council tent is thick with smoke and memory. Romans and Visigoths watching each other across a wavering line of firelight. King Theodoric sits among warriors whose fathers once rode into Rome itself and tore treasures from its temples. And now the eagle they humbled has come begging for their swords. Armor creaks. Hands tighten on spear shafts. And every glare carries the weight of old massacres and broken treaties that no one has truly forgiven. Between the banners of empire and the wolfish standards of the Goths, the silence feels like another blade laid on the table. Aetius does not ask them to love Rome, only to imagine a world where Attila rides unopposed, and there are no Romans and no Goths. Only subjects kneeling or bodies in ditches. Beyond imperial glory and Gothic honor, he points to a smaller, the harder truth, the lives of their children, the villages and churches and halls that will burn the same color under Hun torches. Outside, as the council breaks, hands that once drew steel against each other now meet in reluctant grips. Sealing oaths ground out between clenched teeth. Roman legions, Visigothic warbands, Franks, Burgundians and others begin to move under shared command. Not as friends, but as a battle of nations marching together on the edge of an abyss. Columns of men and horses spill out of Aquitaine and the Rhinelands. Roman shields glinting beside Gothic mail. Frankish spears and Burgundian standards rolling north through fields and forest roads. Ahead of them, Orleans burns against the sky. Attila's host tightening like a fist around its walls, while terrified citizens pack into churches and press their foreheads to cold stone. Aetius and Theodoric drive their armies toward the flames, a race of drumbeats and hooves. And when their vanguard crests the last rise, the Hun king pulls back rather than be caught between city and relief. It is not retreat but choice, a predator slipping away to pick the ground on which the world will bleed. From that moment, the march becomes a shadowing, two vast bodies of men feeling for each other across the broken countryside of northeastern Gaul. Scouts fan out and return with the same whispered report, a broad, open plain and a central ridge that will rule the battlefield like a throne. Both coalitions pour onto the Catalaunian Plains, driving in stakes, raising tents, lining up wagons as the sky lowers and the wind tugs at their banners. By nightfall, under that heavy lid of cloud, everyone knows that what waits here is not a fight for plunder, but a judgment on the future of their world. Dusk settles over the Catalaunian Plains like a lid lowering on a boiling pot, the last light bleeding along spear points and wagon rims. On one side of the field, the Hun camp flickers with orange fire, shamans swaying over horse skulls and bowls of burning herbs, feeding the smoke to a sky that refuses to answer. Warriors sit cross-legged in the dust, sharpening curved blades until they gleam. Horses stamping and snorting as if they too sense the coming storm. Through the lanes of tents walks Attila, heavy and silent, and men fall quiet in his shadow without being told. Across the field, the Roman and Visigothic camp is a patchwork of standards and tongues. Latin prayers rising from one cluster of soldiers, while rough Gothic war songs rumble from another. Inside a lamplit tent, Aetius and Theodoric lean over rough sketched lines scratched into a board, arguing without raising their voices about who will take the brittle center, who will grip the ridge, who will stand nearest to betrayal if the line buckles. The air is thick with sweat, wax, and suspicion. Every gesture a calculation. Every pause a reminder that tomorrow they live or die together. Not as friends, but as necessities. Outside, messengers ride off into the dark between fires, carrying orders that feel more like wagers. Closer to the ground, the night belongs to ordinary men who stare into the flames and pretend not to hear their own armor rattling. Romans, Goths, Franks, Burgundians trade stories in low tones, polishing helmets that may soon lie empty in the trampled grass. And someone mutters that if they fall here, the world will fall with them. Above their heads, a dry, distant thunder begins to roll across the plains. Though the sky is clear and full of cold stars, it sounds like drums buried far beneath the soil, beating time for a battle that has already been promised to the dawn. Dawn comes all at once. a blade of pale light cutting across the Catalaunian Plains and turning every dewdrop on the grass into a shard of glass. For a heartbeat, the field is still. Banners hanging limp. Men squinting toward the dim shape of the central ridge that rises like a low spine from the earth. The hill that will rule the world. Then the horns erupt, snapping the morning in half. And Aetius's plan unfolds in motion. The unreliable Alans under Sengiban pushed into the center. A weak spine held between Roman infantry on one wing and Visigothic ranks on the other. Two iron arms bracing a heart that might fail. Across the plain, Attila sees the same hill and comes to the same conclusion, ordering his best riders forward with a gesture that feels less like command than the release of a weapon already drawn. The field becomes a storm of movement. Hun cavalry thundering out in dense waves. Horsehair standards streaming like black fire. Riders loosing arrows as they run. Roman infantry grind uphill behind locked shields. Boots slipping in torn turf. Their formation, the stubborn wedge of metal straining toward the crest. On the far side, Visigothic foot and cavalry surge forward with a roar. Cloaks and spears flying as they race to keep the ridge from vanishing under Hun hooves. Desperate not to see their one anchor swept away. Between them, the Alans labor up the slope in a ragged line, caught in a maelstrom of arrows that fall so thick they seem to dim the rising sun. The clash on the hill is instant and brutal. Iron and flesh colliding on a slope slicked with churned mud and blood. Horses screaming as they go down under the weight of men who cannot stop. Shields shatter. Spears snap. And for a dizzy stretch of time, it is impossible to tell who is winning. Only that the world has narrowed to the few yards of ground beneath each man's feet. But slowly, painfully, the Roman and Visigothic weight on the flanks begins to tell, and Attila's vanguard is forced back from the crest. The ridge crowned at last with allied shields and torn standards. From his post, Aetius watches the Hun riders break away and understands that they have won the height, but not safety. That this hill is not a salvation, only a fragile piece of breathing room carved out of the apocalypse, pressing in on every side. Attila studies the ridge for only a moment before he understands where the world will break. The height is lost, so he reaches for a different weapon, turning his gaze to the Alans in the center. The thin, uneasy seam holding Roman and Visigothic strength together. One gesture, one blast of the Hun horns, and a black tide of riders peels away from the rest of the host, sweeping toward that weak point with bows already bending. Arrows rise from them in sheets, hissing over the grass and slamming into shields and horses with a sound like hard rain on rotten wood. Down in the Alan ranks, the first storm of missiles shreds the front lines, men toppling before they ever see the riders who killed them. Horses rear and crash into one another, blinded or maddened by pain, and gaps open where tight formations had been only moments before. The Huns wheel away just as quickly, vanishing out of spear range in a spray of clods and hoofbeats, leaving behind a center riddled with holes and bleeding men. Before the Alans can fully close those wounds, the riders turn again, coming back with lowered lances for a crashing charge that hits like a hammer on hot metal. Each impact bends the line a little more, the once straight formation bowing inward toward the ridge. Shields no longer a single wall, but a jagged, shifting brace. Behind their fronts, men glance over their shoulders toward the heights, looking for help that is too far away, wondering whether they are about to be abandoned or simply ground down where they stand. Attila watches it all with narrowed eyes, an artisan of destruction measuring the fracture he is opening, sending Germanic allies into the same gap to wedge it wider. To him, the Alans are not enemies or allies, only the hinge of a door he intends to tear off the world. From the ridge, Aetius sees horses screaming and going down, standards tilting, and the center bowing into a shape that makes his stomach turn cold. He understands that this is the spine of his coalition, and if it snaps, there will be a clear road up the slope into the soft belly of his army. Messengers thunder away from his position toward the Visigothic flank with only one message that matters. A plea wrapped in command Theodoric must hold, must strike, must buy the center time to breathe. For a long moment, as another Hunnic wave gathers in the distance, the fate of the West hangs on that shattered strip of ground where the line is already breaking. On the Visigothic wing, the battle is not lines and maneuvers, but a knotted fist of men and horses punching into itself over and over. Goths and Hun-allied Germans slam together in a blur of mail, fur, and splintered shields, driving spears into faces they recognize from other wars, settling debts that have been accumulating for a generation. The ground is a black mash of trampled grass and blood, hooves slipping, men wrestling in the mud with knives and axes when their weapons break. Every few heartbeats, another rider goes down and vanishes under the boots of his own side, the whole flank heaving like a living thing in pain. Through this chaos rides Theodoric, an aging king who has never learned how to rule from the rear, white hair streaming from the edge of his helm. He weaves his horse between clumps of fighting men, shield up, spear thrusting, shouting orders that are half strategy, half curse, for his presence, a moving anchor for warriors who grew old, listening to his victories. Then, in the crush, near a ravine where the dead are already piling, something hits him, whether spear, javelin, or a flying fragment of shattered weapon, and he pitches backward from the saddle. For a moment his body disappears beneath hooves and legs, and only the sudden hollow in the noise marks that something enormous has just come undone. The words move faster than the dust, carried on breathless messengers and the panicked guesses of men who only half saw what happened. The king is down becomes the king is gone, and the Visigothic line quivers as if a spine has been cut. Some warriors falling back a few steps, others surging forward in blind, directionless rage. At the edge of that breaking line, Torismond, Theodoric's son, sees the gap opening and understands that his father has either vanished into the pit of bodies or is lying somewhere beneath them. Grief hits him like a blow, but he rides into it, not away, turning his horse to face his own men and lifting his blood-slicked spear as a standard. What follows is less decision than detonation. A whole people pivoting around one moment of loss. Torismond drives his warband straight into the teeth of the Hun-aligned forces, and the Visigothic ranks around him ignite, their fear hardening into a cold, terrible ferocity. They slam forward as one, screaming their king's name into the faces of the men who helped kill him, smashing shields aside, dragging riders from their saddles, forcing the enemy back step by grinding step. The shock of their fury ripples outward, pushing Attila's allies away from the ridge and easing the strangling pressure on the shattered center, turning what was about to become a rolling collapse into a surging wave of Gothic vengeance that bends the whole battle in a new direction. When the Visigothic surge and the stubborn Roman line finally start to bite into his front, Attila does not rage. He folds. Horns sound a new pattern, and his battered wings begin to peel back in ragged order toward the rear. Not a rout, but a drawing in of claws around a hidden core. There, behind the churned killing ground, waits the lager he prepared before the first spear was thrown. A tight ring of wagons locked wheel to wheel, chained and braced into a snarling circle of wood, shields, and spears. Within that rough crown lies the heart of his world, tents and chests, his family and his sworn guards, the treasure and bloodlines of an empire that rides instead of rules from stone. The allied coalition follows at a distance, Romans, Goths, and their partners pushing forward over bodies and broken gear until they can see the wagon fortress clearly. A dark halo under the falling light. They know that to storm it would mean driving into a funnel of arrows and javelins, climbing over wreckage and corpses into a killing yard where even victory would drown them in blood. Inside the circle, Night closes in around Attila as fires are lit and shadows lean long against the wagon walls. And the stories say he considers an ending worthy of legend. A towering funeral pyre to consume himself and everything he owns rather than crawl out as a captive. For a moment, the image hangs there in the firelight. Half vision, half nightmare. A conqueror poised between annihilation and survival. But the pyre is not built. The torches are not thrown. And Attila remains seated at the center of his wooden crown, teeth bared behind the shields of his last guard. On the ridge above, Aetius and Torismond watch the wagon ring smolder in the dusk and weigh the cost of finishing what the day began. Feeling the courage of their men collide with the cold arithmetic of assaulting a cornered beast. In the end, they hold back, content to have caged the storm without walking into its eye. And the lager becomes a prison that is also a refuge. The apocalypse has not been slain on the Catalaunian Plains, only driven behind a wall of wagons and will, leaving the world to rest for a while under a shadow that has thinned, but has not yet lifted. When the last commands fade and the horns go silent, the Catalaunian Plains sink into a darkness lit only by scattered fires and the dull gleam of metal under the stars. Bodies lie in drifts where the lines collided hardest. A ragged sea of armor, broken weapons, and torn banners that no one has the strength to gather. The trampled ground still steams in places, and horses stand trembling beside masters who will never rise again. It is a battlefield gone still, but not yet at peace. Later chroniclers will say that the silence did not last, that as the night deepened, the fight rose into the sky. They write of clouds rolling in over the plains, torn by distant flickers of lightning. And in those ragged flashes, some claim to see formations clashing again, phantom riders charging and falling in a war of shadows above the dead. The wind that tugs at the abandoned standards seems to carry voices. A low, broken roar that could be storm or memory or the echo of men who have not yet realized they are gone. Under that troubled sky, the line between history and legend thins to almost nothing. On the ground, scavengers pick their way through the carnage. Romans, Goths, and Huns alike reduced to the same bent shape, searching for friends, for loot, for proof that they themselves are still alive. Now and then a survivor sits down beside a corpse and does not move again, unable to tell whether he has escaped or merely been left behind. Looking up at the restless clouds, many feel a thought they will not say aloud, that perhaps the world did end here today and simply chose to stagger on. This night does not feel like victory, but like a judgment postponed, hanging over the west like a sentence not yet spoken. Dawn spreads slowly over the Catalaunian Plains, turning the frost on armor and flesh into a dull, colorless sheen. From the ridge, the victors look down on a field where Huns, Goths, Franks, Romans, Burgundians and more lie tangled together so thickly that the earth itself is almost hidden. A battle of nations reduced to silence. Visigothic warriors move in a grim search line until they find Theodoric at last, crushed beneath a mound of bodies, and they lift him onto a shield with hands that will not stop shaking. As they carry their dead king away, the fact that the allies have won feels less like triumph and more like permission to start counting their ghosts. Around the plain, there are no songs, no laurel crowns, only men sitting where they dropped, staring at nothing, too tired even to clean the blood from their faces. The coalition has driven Attila back and held the ridge. Yet what remains of their strength feels thin and frayed, every standard drooping in the cold morning air. It is in this moment that Aetius makes the choice that will haunt his memory. He does not press in to crush the lager, does not gamble what is left of Rome on the slaughter of a cornered Hun king. Instead, he allows Attila to withdraw with his hardened core intact, calculating that a shattered Hunnic power might leave the federates, especially the Visigoths, too strong for a dying empire to manage. It is a decision made not in glory, but in the gray light of imperial survival, weighing one danger against another on a scale already cracked. The apocalypse on horseback has been turned away from the gates of the West, but not unhorsed, not unarmed, only sent limping back into the darkness to heal. What the Allies have won on the Catalaunian Plains is not peace, only time. A fragile extension on a debt that will still come due. This is victory without triumph. A morning that feels less like salvation than the uneasy quiet after a verdict delayed. Rome's escape on the Catalaunian Plains proved to be a stay of execution, not a cure. Attila survived, and the following year, his riders poured through the Alpine passes into Italy, burning cities like Aquitaine so thoroughly that later writers claim no trace remained but rumor and ash. His columns pushed deep into the Po Valley, fields trampled, towns ransomed or abandoned, until hunger, disease, and stretched supply lines forced him back again, leaving Italy shaken but still haunted by the knowledge that its survival owed as much to exhaustion as to courage. Each narrow reprieve felt less like divine favor and more like two dying beasts staggering away from each other to lick their wounds. In the years that followed, Flavius Aetius kept walking the same tightrope. The last great Roman general stitching together federate kings and mercenary bands with promises of land, favors, and his own fading prestige. He understood, more clearly than the emperors he served, how close the West had come to being erased, and how thin the barrier between uneasy order and chaos had become. Then, in 454, Emperor Valentinian III murdered Aetius with his own hand in the imperial palace, cutting away the one pillar still propping up the Western state. And within a year, Valentinian himself was dead, leaving a vacuum that no one could fill. Looking back from the far side of that collapse, the victory at the Catalaunian Plains looks less like a turning of the tide than a brief, bright plateau on a downward road. A last mirage of Roman strength shimmering over a desert of decline. In the centuries after the dust settled, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains slipped from raw memory into legend, retold by chroniclers as a night when the West looked into the abyss and saw its own grave staring back. They kept the story of the ghost army in the sky, phantom legions clashing in the clouds above the corpses, as if Rome and its enemies could not stop fighting even after death. Long after the Western Empire itself was gone, its language, laws, and faith moved through the dark like those same ghosts, still struggling for space in the minds and hearts of new kingdoms. Out of those echoes would grow Francia, Western Christendom, and the fragile, to shifting idea of a Europe that did not yet know its own name. Today, the Catalaunian Plains are only quiet fields in northeastern France, tractors and roads where, once the earth drank the blood of nations, the sky above them is usually empty, just clouds and contrails. But if you know the story, it is hard not to imagine shapes moving in that high, pale vault, shadows of riders who refuse to let the world end, standing there. It is fair to ask how much of our maps, our languages, our churches, our cities would exist if Rome and the Visigoths had not stood together on that single desperate day. In the end, the true monument to the Ghost Army is not a stone column, but the still living, imperfect world they seemed to fight for when the apocalypse almost won,